Couple of you folks before. For those I haven't, hi, I'm Ray. I'm the American Whiskey Ambassador with Suntory Global Spirits, based here out of Canada, dealing predominantly with the Beam Distilling Company, which is the distillery we are going to focus on today for the 5 whiskeys we're going to taste. Anybody here big American whiskey fans? Yes. Oh, yeah. I could say. This wouldn't have anything to do with the climate at the moment, would it? No? Okay. Anybody here completely new to the world of American whiskey? No. Okay, so it is just the climate right now. Okay. Let's try and either change your minds or just struggle through the next hour. All right, so basically what we're going to do is, I say American whiskey because we're most known for being a bourbon production facility. This year, the Beam family actually celebrate 230 years of distilling whiskey in the state of Kentucky. And over those 230 years, there's been a couple of really big successes and a couple of really cool things and a hell of a lot of downfalls. So much worry about that. So we're going to kind of talk through a bit of that, go through the 8 generations that have taken the helm of our distillery and really craft their distillery into what it is now, which is to produce the #1 bourbon sold globally. Now when it comes to bourbon in particular, which is going to be 4 of what we drink tonight, it's kind of a strange category of whiskey. Mostly because it is incredibly highly regulated. All the whiskey made anywhere in the world, we are by far under the strictest regulations when it comes to our production. Now, in order to kind of work through all of those rules and regulations with you, I mean, it's an incredibly boring document that it was brought into place in 1964 to put these rules forward. But there's probably about 7 really, really important points to take away from it. We always call them the ABCs of bourbon because it's just an easy way to remember, right? So A, bourbon must be American made. Now, that's pretty much US law, right? But it's kind of governed internationally the same way we would say a champagne, right? Different trade agreements, I'm going to get into the dodgy area here. Different trade agreements between different countries usually will uphold certain standards. So pretty much the global standard that's been recognized by anywhere that does have a free trade agreement with the US is that they will abide by the fact that bourbon must be made within the United States of America. B relates to our barrels. So like whiskey made anywhere in the world, we'll mature our product in barrels, right? The industry standard that we use is 53 gallon, but the type of barrels we use are very specific. They have to be first time use, freshly charred white oak barrels. So first time use, nothing can ever have been in that barrel beforehand. Freshly charred means we basically burn the crap out of the inside of the barrel. And the reason we do this is twofold. Firstly, when you char the inside of a barrel, burn it, you create a layer of charcoal. And charcoal is an incredible filter. So any slight little imperfections that are left over after the distillation process, that charcoal is going to filter it all out and make sure the final product in your bottle or in your glass is a smooth, tasty, big, bold bourbon, right? Secondly, white oak is full of natural sugars. So when we start to treat it with heat, when we char the inside of it, right behind that layer of charcoal, we're going to get what we call the red layer, which is basically a layer of caramelized sugars. So when we fill that barrel full of new make spirit, white lightning, white dog, moonshine, whatever you want to call it, and we send it out to the warehouses, the barrel's going to go through kind of this breathing effect over the course of its lifetime. It's going to get warm outside, the wood is going to expand, the pores will open up, the whiskey will seep through that layer of charcoal and rest in that layer of caramelized sugars, taking on all those beautiful vanilla, butterscotch, caramel, maple, those are the sugar flavors, right? Then wintertime will roll around, it'll start to get cold outside, it's kind of like squeezing a sponge. All the whiskey that's in the walls of the wood, you're going to start seeping back out, bringing with it all those flavors, mingling with everything else in the barrel, and that's basically what we mean by the maturation phase, the maturation period of the barrel. This will happen season over season, year over year, as long as that barrel is sitting out in the warehouse. But how long it has to stay in that barrel, is not technically governed by law. There's no legal minimum requirement like you would have, say, Canadian whiskey for 3 years, Scotch whiskey for 3 years. All the law says is that it has to pass through that barrel. However, if you're making a straight bourbon, which everything you're going to drink here tonight is, it has to be in that barrel for at least 2 years. At our distillery, we have kind of a self-imposed minimum of 4 years. It'll be the youngest product we will allow to leave our distillery. C. C relates to corn. So at its very simplest, whiskey is distilled beer. Now that's the start of the process, is we make a beer. We call it distiller's beer because we're not that creative. But basically in order to make that beer, we need grains. So our grain recipe, or mash bill you'll often hear it be called, of that grain recipe, at least 51% of the grains we use have to be corn. Then you'll see flavoring grains, traditionally rye or wheat, and you'll usually see malted barley being included. Malted barley brings some really cool fruity and floral notes, but it's also really good at kickstarting fermentation and for the continuation of flavors batch to batch, barrel to barrel. D, E, and F, these are all kind of focused around what we call temping or proofing. It's basically alcohol by volume at each step of the process. So D, it's double distilled to no higher than 80% alcohol after the second distillation run. E, when we enter it into the barrel, it can't be any higher than 62.5% alcohol. And finally F, when we fill our bottles, it can't be any lower than 40% alcohol. And finally G, to me this is the most important part. Bourbon is what we call a genuine product. The use of any additives whatsoever, any coloring additives, any flavoring additives are completely prohibited in the production of bourbon. So when you look at the glasses in front of you that have liquid in it, you're looking at quite literally the culmination of water, yeast, wood, grain, and time. So let's have a little drink together because I certainly get a lot more interesting than you're drunk. So the glass that you've got in front of you, our first whiskey for the evening, is going to be Gin Beam Black. We wanted to start you off with something that we consider to be a cornerstone of everything that we do at our distillery. Now when you look at how to taste whiskeys, we have a kind of a bit of a problem with people telling you how to drink your whiskey. Oh, thank you so much. This is great. We very, very much believe that when you buy the bottle, it's yours, drink it whatever way you want. If you like your whiskey in a gallon of milk, you can fill your boots, have at it, right? You know, we won't drink it like that. That being said, we do have a couple of little tips and tricks that our quality control team and whiskey making team use on a daily basis to kind of make sure they can get as even a flavor, I guess, so they can actualize the flavors of the whiskey as evenly as possible throughout the course of their projects. So number one, if you want to take your glass, hold it up to the light. One thing bourbon can do is tell you something by looking at it. No other form of whiskey can do that with 100% confidence because we are not allowed to use any flavor, any colorings. Now generally, the lighter it is, it's going to be one of two things. Either a younger spirit or it's going to be a lower in alcohol. The darker it is, it's going to be one of two things, or maybe both. Higher in age or higher in alcohol. The reason I say higher in alcohol is because we added less water to it when it comes out of the bottle, right? So you'll see what Gin Beam Black kind of has a deep golden color. So this starts off clear, right? So what we know from this is that it's probably been in the barrel for at least 4 or 5 years. This is going to be a minimum of 7 years in the barrel. We also know it's not going to be super, super high in alcohol because it will be a lot darker and richer. We're going to see this when we get to maybe the last whiskey of the day. And you'll see what I mean by when it gets really, really kind of brown. When we're doing our first nosing of the whiskey, always recommend you keep your glass probably about 1 inch to 2 inches away from your nose and keep your lips apart. So just take a nice soft little breath in. The reason we part our lips is you've basically got this little tunnel that runs down the back of your nose, down like this, right? We call it the olfactory canal. When you close off your lips, you're basically closing one end of the circuit. So when you start to nose in all of those alcohol vapors, they have nowhere to go, so they get stuck in your nose, right? You get 2, 3, 4 whiskeys into a tasting, everything starts to smell. If you open that olfactory canal, open the circuit, those alcoholic vapors are going to start sitting on the back of your tongue. That's why when you nose it, you can almost start to taste some of the aromas that are coming off. Now, the main things you should be picking up here, and I'm not really big on giving off flavor notes or tasting notes, because as humans, we're so open to suggestion that if I say, oh, those lovely hints of chocolate, you're just going to start smelling chocolate, right? This is your journey. You're the one who gets to experience these whiskeys tonight. Whatever you're tasting is correct. There's no flavor additives in here. So just remember that whatever flavors you get, you are not wrong. The main chemical components that we should be getting off it will be things like vanilla, caramel, butterscotch, those traditional bourbon. On to our first little sip. I would say take maybe about a quarter of what's in your glass and try and roll it around the inside of your mouth. Coat as much of your mouth as possible. You might start getting a little bit of a tingle. When that happens, swallow and then breathe out straight away. You want to try and push all that alcohol vapor that's accumulating inside your mouth out, so that when you take a nice little breath in, the oxygen come in, it hits the alcohol that's coated your mouth, opens the flavor up, and will allow you to get deeper and deeper down into the natural flavor that exists in the whiskey. All make sense? Yeah? Cool. Anybody need me to talk slower? I haven't drank it all today, so the Irish won't come out just yet.
Honestly, Irish. We were contemplating.
You were like, where is that fucker from? It has to be Newfoundland.
We were putting it on the East Coast, but we weren't sure how far east.
I'm from the East Coast.
Yeah.
Not this one, but.
And what about Ireland?
Actually, I'm not from the East Coast, I'm from the very middle of Ireland, the place with the least amount of people. Which is why I'm here. Alright, so what you're drinking right now is Jim Beam Black 7-year-old. A product that is pretty new to us in that the 7-year age-rated product. But this whiskey itself first came out in 1972. But to really think about the whole history of this brand, we got to get back a hell of a lot further. We're going to go back to about 1785. And this new fledgling US government introduces a program called the Virginia Corn and Cabbage Patch Act. And the whole idea behind this act was to try and convince people to move westward away from the eastern seaboard. It was a land grab, it was a land sale, right? So you had a bunch of farming families who themselves were immigrants. They had already moved over from places like Ireland, Scotland, the Netherlands, Germany, settled along the eastern seaboard, and now they were applying for land grants for further inward. One of these families that applied was a family called the Bowen family. They would eventually anglicize their name to Beam after they make the move westward. A few of the family members got together, they put an application through, they were granted 690 acres of land in an incredibly remote area of West Virginia, the western tip of West Virginia, which we now know as being the state of Kentucky, and a small little town, or what would become a small town, called Hardin's Creek, Kentucky. So they set off, and what would take us now about 11 hours to drive took them 2 years to walk. We actually don't know a huge amount about the family and what happened over the course of those 2 years. But what we do know is, through some family writings, is what they brought with them for travels. And one thing was an alembic still. Pretty much what perfume makers used to make perfume, right? You can also make some pretty high octane alcohol off it. But it would only produce about a pint of alcohol per day. You see, in the early days of the US, alcohol wasn't just treated as a luxury spirit that we get to sit here, have a cigar and drink, right? It was a form of currency, really. That's how the whiskey world started. It was farmers with excess grains trying to find a way to make sure they could use those grains before they got spoiled. So by the time the Beam family made their way to Kentucky and landed in Kentucky, or what we now know as Kentucky, they had already got this whole history or internal history of making whiskey behind them. So they set up their little farm. By law, they had to use a certain amount of this farm to grow corn. So now they were going to be corn farmers with a lot of excess corn grain who were used to making whiskey off excess grain. So they were making corn whiskey. And every family who made this trip across the Appalachian Mountains and into the state of Kentucky were doing this process. And that was really the birth of bourbon. The Beam family, the patriarch of the family at the time, was a guy by the name of Johannes Jacob Bowen, or Jacob Beam as he anglicized his name. Old Jake was the one who, we call him the pioneer within the family. He was the first person to really making whiskey a thing within the Beam family. So he set up a small little farm. People could come and buy dirty old jugs of moonshine essentially off him. And it was good, made a good little penny out of it. He would eventually get old, retire, pass the distillery on to his son David. And David said, you know what, we're making good whiskey and people are buying it, but man, it's a hell of a time shutting down those stills and waiting for them to cool down and cleaning them out. maybe we should invest in some column stills. Much more effective means of production, means we can, and you know, shouldn't have to clean them as often. Might be worth the money. So he invests in column stills. Now we're making a lot more whiskey because we can make it a lot easier and a lot more efficient. David Beam retires, his son David M. Beam takes over the family's business. And he says, you know, more people are coming to us to buy whiskey than are coming to buy grain. So let's just give the people what they want. Let's start a brand of whiskey. He realizes living in Hardin's Creek, which still to this day is in the middle of absolute nowhere, is maybe not the best place to start a business. So he moves the family business into Nelson County, Kentucky. So anyone's ever been down there, you've probably done the Bourbon Trail. Bourbon Trail starts out in Bardstown, Kentucky. That is the center of the bourbon universe and the center of Nelson County. The reason that was the center of the universe was because they were building the L&M Railroad at the time. It was an easy way for raw ingredients to come into one central point, for people to use those raw ingredients to produce something, and then fill those trains back up with the final product, which was bourbon, and send them out to bigger audiences and wider audiences. Now they were starting to create a corporate enterprise, right? This was now a commercial enterprise. So they needed a name. Well, David M. Beam loved the way people used to come and buy whiskey originally. We weren't putting them in bottles and throwing them on the shelves in stores. You would come to a distillery with a big old mason jar, and there'd be this huge tub of whiskey. Then you just dunk it in, seal it up, and that's how you bought whiskey. So he decided to call the distillery the Old Tub Distillery, and we released our first brand of whiskey, which was Old Tub Bourbon. David M. Beam, unfortunately, wasn't an incredibly healthy man. He passed away at the age of 53, and the family's business defaulted to his 18-year-old son, James Beauregard Beam, or Jim Beam, friends of family. Jim would spend the next 60 years running the family business, from 18 until he retires, well, just before his 74th birthday. Jim took us all the way up to Prohibition, turning this small little family distillery in Nelson County, Kentucky into the first real nationally available brand of bourbon whiskey. Everything was going pretty damn good for the Beam family. And then a bunch of folks in 1920 decided that the best idea in the world would be to make this whole alcohol thing illegal. So, records screeched to a halt. We stopped making whiskey officially. And the Beam family had to find a way to make money. Jim ran down to Florida, bought himself a citrus orchard, which failed miserably. So to be able to win his legs, he kind of came back to Kentucky and found this old limestone quarry, bought that, decided to go into the quarry business, that failed miserably. Kind of joke at the time was the Beam family got into the whole funeral home business, folks just stopped dying. He wasn't really very good at much things except for making whiskey, so he was incredibly happy on December 5th, 1933, when Prohibition was repealed, and we could finally start getting back to what the Beam family had done for the previous 4 generations, which was to make whiskey. Within 120 days of the repeal of Prohibition, our distillery was back open and we were starting to make whiskey again. Only one big problem. There was some people making whiskey during Prohibition. It was the American Medicinal Alcohol Association. You couldn't go to a store, buy some whiskey, but you go to your doctor and say you have a sore back, and he could prescribe you. Somebody had to be making that, right? So National Distillers was a company who was pretty much left in charge of it. They had 6 distilleries that were open, but they couldn't produce enough whiskey out of those distilleries to meet the demand of all these sore backs that were going around the US. So they started buying up brands, and they bought up the Old Tub brand off the Beam family. So we were back making whiskey, and we could still use the recipe, but we could no longer use the name Old Tub. So Jim, he's 74 at the time, he's ready to retire, and he says to his son, you take over now, it's your turn. And his son, T. Jeremiah, takes over the business, and as an act of respect to his father, he renames the Old Tub Distillery as the J.B. Beam Distilling Company, and he renames the Old Tub's Bourbon as Jim Beam. And we released our first bottle of Jim Beam in 1935, and we haven't looked back since. The T. Jeremiah took us basically from being a nationally available brand within the US to being really the first globally available brand of bourbon. Right after World War II, realizing that so many American GIs had stayed stationed all over the world, he started to just send them whiskey. A little taste of home for the boys, Well, they'd start sharing it with the locals, and the locals got a taste for it. They'd start requesting some more. Sure, we'll send some more. And it kind of started to grow from there. Things were looking good for the Beam family. TJRMI got ready to retire. Only problem was, for the last 5 generations, the distillery has passed father to son. TJRMI didn't have any kids. Now, luckily for us, during Prohibition, his sister Margaret had married into the Noe family, N-O-E, and they had a couple of kids, but one in particular was definitely the person they were looking at as being the future of the company. His name was Frederick Booker Noe II, or Booker, as everybody knows him. You ever had Booker's bourbon? That's Booker. There you go. That's the man who drank Booker's and made it through. So Booker viewed bourbon in a bit of a different way. He felt like we were shortchanging the general consumer. Booker remembered what bourbon was like pre-Prohibition. Bourbon was big, bold, flavorful, rich, heavy. And he felt that after Prohibition, we had kind of lost that as an industry. And to give you an idea of what I mean, pre-Prohibition, your standard average run-of-the-mill bourbon was about 4 or 5 years of age, about 50% alcohol. After Prohibition, standard bourbon was about 2 years of age, 40% alcohol. I'm not saying one was better than the other, but they were very different, almost categorically different. Bourbon wanted to return bourbon to the glory that it had before Prohibition, but by this point, we're now in the late 60s. It had been 40 years, 45 years since Prohibition had taken effect. I wasn't 100% sure if people were actually interested in tasting what bourbon was like before. So he decided he was going to do a little bit of a trial. He was going to take our Jim Beam White, our 4-year-old 20% or 40% alcohol spirit, and just leave it in the barrel for a little bit longer. Twice as long to be exact. Up the alcohol a little bit to 45%, and just send it out. Just test. See if people like the heavier spirit. That was a much bigger success than he thought it was going to be. When he released this spirit, which was originally called Colonel Bean's 8-year-old black bourbon whiskey. Over the course of time, the spirit has taken a little bit of a change from years to years. So we've ended up what it is now, which is our Jim Beam Black 7-year-old whiskey. Now Booker, his goal behind this wasn't this whiskey. The goal was to try and find a way to, as I said earlier, bring back that pre-Prohibition style, to really make bourbon a luxury item again. Because bourbon had faltered a couple of times in the post-Prohibition era.
Thank you.
I think one of the biggest parts, one of the really worst periods in the world of American whiskey wasn't Prohibition itself. It was a few years after Prohibition. Things kind of opened up a little loosey-goosey. The rules hadn't really been put in place yet. You had this era of the rectifiers, they call them. It's the era of the light whiskey, where it was 80% neutral grain spirit, or essentially vodka, topped up with 20% whiskey, and sold as whiskey. Well, if they can write whiskey on the bottle, and people are going to think it's whiskey, and it's a hell of a lot cheaper to make, a lot cheaper to pump out than waiting for the good stuff. And the view has shifted to, that's what American whiskey is, not this, right? Bourbon sales plummeted and plummeted and plummeted. This was really when we start to see the rise in, clear spirits, really. Vodka, gin, to a degree, rum and tequila, but really vodka and gin took off massively. All we have to do is look at the cocktail culture of the 60s and 70s, 80s, really more so. There's got to be something we're missing. They start to taste all these products. And that was really when bourbon started to fully get its footing back after Prohibition, which was about 60 years after the repeal of Prohibition. Now at the time, we go say to around, let's say 84. Booker had been in charge now for about 20 years, and he'd been working on a style of production where it was really more of a philosophy around the idea of maturation and how maturation works. And I spoke earlier on about that kind of breathing effect of the barrel. It gets warm, pushes the whiskey into the wood, it gets cold, it squeezes out like a sponge. People knew this is how it worked, right? And when you have a place like Kentucky that has really, really hot summers and really, really cold winters, that breathing effect within the barrel is really aggressive. It basically means that the whiskey matures incredibly fast. again, this is something that people in Kentucky knew. Nobody ever looked at it on a smaller scale than that. When you look at our maturation warehouses, rack houses, rake houses, whatever you want to call them, these are big buildings, right? And some of our smaller ones are 9 floors. They hold about 50 to 60,000 barrels of whiskey. These aren't small buildings, right? Unlike anybody who has ever lived in a, 3rd, 4th floor apartment during the summertime with no AC will tell you, temperature on the ground floor is not always the same as the temperature as you start going up in the building. So what Booker started to realize was that depending on where in the warehouse you put the barrel, that final product could be drastically different from 1st floor to 9th floor, for example. So he essentially started to map out different areas of the warehouse where flavors developed in just a very specific way to basically end up with very specific flavored whiskeys. And he decided, I'm going to start to mature whiskeys just in these little areas, right? But now we're working with a much more concentrated and smaller area, which means we can only put a small amount of barrels in. And when Booker would describe it to people, he would describe it as a small batch of barrels. And that was really the birth of small batch bourbon. Small batch on the label of a bottle of whiskey has no legal definition. Technically, you could make something that's 25,000 barrels a day or something and call it small batch, because it would be small compared to 1 million barrels a day, right? No legal definition. But the Booker had nothing about defining the product itself, it was more about defining the style of maturation that he was using. Now around about the same time, our distillery was owned by a company called Fortune Brands. Fortune Brands, around about the late 80s, would become Beam Brands Incorporated. Fortune Brands were on the search to try and diversify their American whiskey portfolio. And a company called National Distillers, who we spoke about just a second ago, they were the ones making medicinal alcohol during Prohibition. They were getting rid of a bunch of brands of whiskey because once everyone was allowed to start making it again, they didn't really have the same sort of number of clientele. So they were selling off a portfolio of whiskeys that they nicknamed the Olds. There was Old Overholt Rye, Old Taylor Bourbon, Old Crow Bourbon, and Old Grandad Bourbon. Fortune Brands purchased it, it gets rolled into our distillery, and now Booker is the one who's in charge of producing these whiskeys. And Booker was a massive Old Grandad fan. So he thought, imagine if I get this whiskey, this new recipe I've never worked with before, this new yeast strain I've never used before, and I start maturing it in these very specific small parts of the warehouse, I could take one of my favorite whiskeys and possibly make it better. Let's give it a go. Distilled some product, sends it out to the warehouse, leaves it sit there for about 8 years, comes back, 1992, tests the whiskey, and it's soft, gentle, light. It is almost the complete opposite of what Booker was trying to do. And his first reaction was, all right, get rid of it. It's not what I was going for, so cut it, redistill. Thankfully for us, for many reasons, but for this one in particular, Booker's right-hand lady was a woman called Kathleen Lee Benedetto, and she saw the opportunity with this whiskey. The one you've got in your glass right now, which is Basil Hayden. Basil Hayden, yes, it's light, it's soft, it's gentle, the flavors are quite subtle. It's the opposite of what Booker was going for, right? But the genius that Kathleen saw in it was that at the time, the majority of people who were drinking whiskey, they walk into a bar and ordering a whiskey straight up, they were ordering Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey. Right? Irish whiskey by nature, by design, is light, it's soft, it's honey, it's floral qualities, it's easy, right? Scotch whiskey, if you were to take away the island of Islay and focus on the rest of the country, it's actually quite a light spirit base. They can play around and have a lot more when it comes to finishing and stuff, but in general, it's a light spirit base. The spirit base of bourbon is quite heavy and rich and bold. So Kathleen was like, okay, well, we're expecting somebody to stop drinking Irish whiskey, for example, and to start drinking bourbon. And your idea is to let them go from drinking this really soft, honey-like 40% alcohol whiskey and move into drinking something that's 65% alcohol. They're never going to have a second one. But now we have this. which exhibits all the flavors that we want a bourbon to exhibit without jumping out of the glass and using it across the face, right? It's kind of that perfect little stepping stone into the world of bourbon. So Booker says, sure, okay, let's keep it. He decides to, as a kind of tip of his cap to the family who created the old Grandad brand, which was the grain recipe he was using, the Hayden family. He decided he was going to name this after the patriarch of that family, their first distiller, and it was Meredith Basil Hayden Sr. So Basil Hayden, as a brand, was born. And here's the weird thing though with Basil Hayden. It's kind of where we stopped. It hit the shelves, and we just kind of let it run, right? Mostly because Booker had no idea what to do next with it. You know, it's bringing people into the world of bourbon. It's acting as that stepping stone. You know, what else can we expect for it to do? So as a brand, Basil Hayden kind of got lost a little bit. Just it had one purpose, and that was the purpose it served on a daily basis. In 1993, Booker decides to retire, and his son Fred takes over as our master distiller, our seventh generation of the Beam family, to run distillation efforts at our distillery. Now, Booker was innovative. He liked to push the envelope, liked to try new things. He was very cool with the idea of redefining what it is to be a bourbon. Fred is as innovative, but a little bit maybe more traditional. His whole thing was he wanted to take the brands his father had created and expand on them. So over the course of time, you know, we start to see a couple different Jim Beam brands pop around. Knob Creek, you know, we all of a sudden went from having 2 Knob Creeks, our bourbon on our rye, to 7 different Knob Creeks. We released Booker's Rye. We're expanding on Baker's bourbon. Basil Hayden always just kind of kept as being that brand in the back. Right now, we are actually operated by 2 master distillers. Fred is still active and has been an active master distiller at our distillery since '93. But now our generation 8, Fred's son Freddie, has stepped into the master distiller role as we kind of bridge the gap between generations. Freddie is very, very much like his grandfather. He wants to be the person who redefines what American whiskey could be. So it's going to give you an idea of how a Beam family member ends up as being a master distiller. It is very, very much not a birthright. The number 1 rule of the family when it comes to, oh, you want to be part of the whiskey business, is leave. You have to go. Go, do university, get out of here, see that there's a life beyond whiskey, try something new, and if you still want to be a whiskey maker, then come back and we'll start that process. Freddie went off, he did university, realized that whiskey was his thing, so he came back. He worked bottling line, overnight bottling line, drove the delivery trucks, drove the grain trucks, did tours at the distillery, landscaping, finally ended up in our R&D department, so our research and development department. That's where a lot of the fun stuff happens. And they thought, you know, we're going to play a little careful with Freddie, because we really think he could be the one to not just bring our distillery, but bring American whiskey as a whole into this new generation and to make it appeal to a whole new generation of drinkers. So let's send him somewhere outside the US to learn how to make whiskey. And they sent him up here, Canada, out to Alberta Distillers in Calgary. And I'm pretty happy and confident in saying the best distillers in the world of 100% rye whiskey. Distillery quite literally purpose built for it. They wanted to just see how people do things differently. So Freddie came up, you know, he's doing a warehouse tour, they're pulling whiskey out of the barrels, letting him taste it. He's falling in love with this gutsy, spicy, peppery, but also super sweet and really zippy whiskey that he had never really thought about a whole lot before. And they start to teach him about how we make products like Canadian Club. You know, and how the classic Canadian style of distilling your corn separately and aging it separately. Distilling your rye separately and aging that separately. Distilling your barley and aging your barley completely separately. And then once they're all at maturation, letting the final products together. In America, we'll take all our grains, we'll cook them all together, we'll distill it all together, we'll ferment it together, or ferment it, distill it, mature it, It's all done at the start. So Freddie started thinking, well, let's take our grain recipe, right? Let's say, for argument's sake, this is definitely not our official grain recipe. Let's say our grain recipe is 75% corn, 13% rye, and 12% malt. So theoretically, if I take corn whiskey, 100% corn, that's 4 years of age, and I fill a bottle up 75% of the way, then I add another 13% of rye and another 13 or 12% of barley, that should taste like Jim Beam White. But what he realized is it tasted completely different. And this really opened up the world of blending to Fred. So he started thinking about Canadian rye, 100% rye whiskey with that nice little zip to it. And the rye whiskey we make at our distillery in Kentucky, which is nice and sweet. And he thought, I wonder if I could make a whiskey that kind of had both of them working in harmony, working in perfect balance, get the best of both worlds, exhibit the spice and the sweet. So he started working on a blend. He finally gets the flavors together, adds a little drop of a port style wine into it, and we have really what would end up being the first major innovation within the world of Basil Hayden, coming purely out of a guy learning how to be a whiskey maker, mucking around in the store, right? What we decided, or what we realized, was that there was a whole different world of drinkers out there. People who weren't really crazy about our Basil Hayden, they weren't crazy about the bourbon, but now they were crazy about this rye. So we were opening up the world of whiskey. We were opening up the world of us really to more people, but opening up the world of whiskey to more people, giving people an avenue into this beautiful whiskey journey that we are all on, right? So the idea was to start creating a portfolio of whiskeys that were light, subtle, approachable, gentle, still full of flavor, that exhibited the full spectrum of flavors that are available within the world of whiskey. After we released our dark rye, we moved back into the world of bourbon. We released our Basil Hayden Toast, which is utilizing some more non-traditional ingredients. Instead of using rye as our flavoring grain, we're using brown rice. Using toasted barrels instead of just charred barrels. We released our Basil Hayden Subtle Smoke. We were smoking our barrels and our whiskey before bottling them to add that soft little hint of, well, essentially tobacco smoke. And then we released the whiskey that's just being going around being poured for you right now, which is probably my favorite Basil Hayden we've ever produced, which is our Basil Hayden red wine cask finish. So the first whiskey that you tried, the first Basil Hayden you tried, that's our OG. That's our original, that's been on the market since 1993. We will take that spirit, then we will go out to a little winery out in Sonoma, California, and we'll purchase some barrels off. We're pretty much using exclusively Pinot Noir barrels for this project. And we're doing what we kind of refer to as a leaching of flavor. So rather than doing a full secondary maturation where we could be looking at 4, 6, 8 months, we're only doing about 10 to 12 weeks of this whiskey sitting inside that barrel. It's going to leach a lot of color through it. I mean, if you hold this glass up and have a look at the color of the whiskey in it, you'll see how much color that red wine cask has leached into it. We want to get some of those nice, light, fruity, slightly tart notes coming off the red wine barrel, but we don't want to overtake it. Because at the end of the day, we're a bourbon producing company. We don't want to produce something that tastes absolutely nothing like bourbon. Right? We want to still have bourbon be the backbone of it. So we get that soft, little kind of glazing almost of red wine, but the bourbon still carries through. Since then, we have released our Basil Hayden malted rye. We're looking at possibly bringing this to Canada either by the end of this year or maybe next year. I don't know if anyone's had a malted rye before. It is wild. When you malt rye, people always associate rye with being kind of spicy, peppery, sharp. When you malt rye, it gives off these really cool, herbaceous, very floral. I mean, when you open the bottle and take a sniff of it, it smells kind of like a bag of Lay's dill pickle chips. in the best way possible. It's really, really, really interesting, has some beautiful flavors. I personally think that y'all would love this. So we're working on bringing it up here, and we do have another cask finish that we're working on. It's not fully finished yet, fully ready, but hopefully we'll be able to bring this to you. But the whole reason I went through each of those spirits, each of those different iterations or innovations in the Basil Hayden brand, is to show you what the goal was, the plan was. And that was, as I said, to create a portfolio of whiskeys that exhibit all the flavors that are available within the spectrum of whiskey. So that when we look at people who are just trying bourbon for the first time, just trying American whiskey for the first time, they can sit down with a sample of 2 or 3 or 4 different whiskeys and say, hey, you know what? I didn't like the original, but I really like that red wine cask finish. Then the person behind your bar, the person in the store would say, oh, you know what? If you like that finish, I think I have a good idea for you. They can direct you now, help guide you more really efficiently through that whiskey journey that you just embarked on. Now with the introduction of Basil Hayden into, well, really, the introduction of the world of small batch bourbon, this was where the world of American whiskey shifted. A lot of distillers have been sitting on old whiskey, and good whiskey, really, really good whiskey. But there was always this kind of fear about, should we release it? Like, we're selling a decent amount of what we make right now. What if they hate it? Booker, to put it quite frankly, didn't care. You know, he was on a mission to return bourbon to its pre-prohibition glory, so he said, keep making it, keep making it. If the new people don't drink it, people my age will drink it. Luckily for Booker, he rolled a good one on it, and people did start drinking. And then all of a sudden, we start to have this flooding of the industry of higher age spirits, of more luxurious and elegant spirits coming out, and the bourbon boom started. You know, we kind of thought at the time, 10 years. We'll get a good 10 years out of this, and then we will be on to tequila or gin or rum or something. But it has just kept rolling and rolling and rolling. And now as we enter our 8th generation of master distiller within the Beam family running distillation efforts at our distillery, we're starting to push that envelope again. We're starting to try new things. And one of the biggest commitments to our distillery, or really our ownership group, Suntory, over in Japan, one of the biggest commitments they gave us when it came to allowing us or being behind us, innovating and trying a bunch of new stuff, was they allocated us a bunch of money back in I think it was 18, 19, end of 18, started 19 originally, to create a new distillery. If you ever go onto the Jim Beam website or the Beam Distilling website, or if you're lucky enough to be down in Kentucky and you come visit us, you'll probably come to a distillery in Clermont, Kentucky. Beautiful, big, white buildings everywhere that are our visitor center, statues of the generations that have come beforehand, big old black warehouses that are, most of them falling down right now, held up by as many steel beams as we can possibly find. That's our Clermont distillery. That is the home of our small batch bourbons. Every ounce of Knob Creek or Basil Hayden that you drink is coming out of that distillery. About 6 miles down the road, in Boston, Kentucky, we also have a distillery called the Booker Knoll plant. If you had a Jim Beam White or a Jim Beam Black, it has come from that. That is the workhorse. So Clermont is pumping out about 1,000 barrels of whiskey a day. Boston's pumping out anywhere from 2,000 to 2,500 barrels of whiskey a day. But then we also have a third distillery. Just off to the side in Clermont, just away from prying eyes, we have what we call the FBN, the Fred B. Knoll Craft Distillery. This is a distillery that was built solely for our whiskey making team to play around. Hopefully they'll strike gold. This isn't just, hey, let's see if we use 10% rye instead of 15% rye. I was down there first week of December. We have 12 fermenters. Each fermenter was working with a different style of whiskey. Realistically, we'll never get to taste any of those. This is trying them out, right? But one specific whiskey did come from that distillery, and it's going to be the next one that we pour up. But it's also a little bit of a step out of our comfort zone. 230 years, Beam family have made bourbon. They're a bourbon family. Yeah, we've made rye, we've made a couple different types of bourbon, but that's pretty much been our bread and butter for 230 years. Last year, we released our first ever single malt, our American single malt. Thank you. Yes, it was definitely me. I did all the hard work. All you. Yeah, Freddie would say it was him, but it wasn't.
No, it was you.
Yeah, totally. Now, when we first released it last year, there was no legal definition behind what you had to do in order to call yourself an American single malt. On actually my birthday last year, best birthday gift I've ever gotten, was they finally ratified American whiskey, December 18th of last year. We now have rules to follow. It's no longer the Wild West of whiskey making. As of January 19th, 2025, all American whiskey, or all American single malt must follow these rules. Firstly, it has to be made from a fermented mash of 100% barley. Pretty standard for a single malt, right? Made at one distillery, pretty standard for a single malt. Has to be matured for a minimum of 2 years. So unlike Ireland, Scotland working on 3, minimum of 2 years. And containers no larger than 700 liters, and real small. Just real. And that's why it's here about small. No. 700 liters and matured for its entirety in the US. It can contain 0 neutral grain spirit. Here's what I love. It may contain E150A caramel coloring, as long as the distillery is prepared to put that on the label. So, if you want to use the coloring and you want to try and trick your customers, have at it. But you better put it in big bold lettering on the front label so that people know what you've done to it. What it does is, in my opinion, it opens up a little bit of transparency within the world of whiskey, right? Which, with bourbon being so, I guess, so highly regulated, it just naturally has all these levels of transparency. This brings that to this new world of American whiskey, while still allowing people the option of trying to mess around with certain things. So, the whiskey that is being poured for you right now is our first step into the world of single malt whiskey. You're about to try Clermont Steep American Single Malt. Now, there's a couple of things that I really want to point out with Clermont Steep. When the idea came for us to release a single malt, there was an email went out to all of our ambassador team. At the time, there was a few of us in the US and the South here in Canada, and then one in Australia. Was to go to as many tastings as we possibly could of North American distilleries that make single malts. And just take notes. See how they present themselves, see what the reaction is from the people trying it. What we noticed was there was a couple of recurring themes. And one was the ask the audience portion of it, where you can say, okay, well, what sort of single malt do you like? Oh, well, I really like Irish single malts. Okay, you know what? Like Irish single malts, we've got this. We made that Irish single malt style. Has a lot of those nice, light, soft, subtle flavors, lots of honey, lots of floral. How about yourself, sir? Oh, well, I like your little Speyside single malt. Okay, well, you're really gonna like this because we made this in that Speyside style. It has some more of those kind of earthy, maltier styles, a little bit of that soft caramel going through the back. What we realized was that these distilleries were making North American whiskey for people who don't drink North American whiskey. They were making whiskey for Scotch drinkers and Irish whiskey drinkers. They weren't making whiskey for people who drink North American whiskey. So our vision behind Clermont Steep was to make a single malt that is not made for Scotch whiskey drinkers. And it's not made for Irish whiskey drinkers. It is made and directed solely at American whiskey drinkers. Now, if you're an Irish whiskey drinker or a Scotch whiskey drinker and you like this one when you drink it, well, you're no longer a solely Scotch whiskey or Irish whiskey drinking person, right? This is designed for that palate. And there's a couple of small little things that we do during the production process that showcase that. Firstly, let's look at our grains. 100% malted barley, using 2 different strains. 80% of this is going to be our standard distiller's malt, distiller's barley. 20% is going to be golden pilsner barley. The barrels that we mature it in are going to be first time use, freshly charred, or freshly toasted. So we kind of bring a little bit of the bourbon world into it, right? It's going to leach a lot of those natural sugars in very, very quickly. The toasted barrels will be toasted over low heat for about 2.5 hours. The charred barrels, to char number 1, 15 seconds, 1300 degree flame. What that's going to do is just crack the initial surface of the wood, create a tiny layer of charcoal, and create a really, really, really heavily flash charred layer of caramelized sugars. It's going to give a lot of sweetness without giving a lot of the rest of the dry or spicy aspects of the wood. Again, focusing on the American whiskey drinker, because bourbon is sweet. Bourbon is, that's the flavor profile with it. We will cook our grains for 3 hours. We will ferment our mash for 3 days. The exact same as all of our bourbons and all of our ryes. It's going to be bottled at 47% alcohol, and it will spend a minimum of 5 years in that barrel. I'll be fully transparent with you. Very, very, very few of the barrels that were used to produce the first run of Clermont Sleep, which this is, went over the 6-year mark. Now, one thing that was brought up in our very, very first ever time that we presented this to a group of folks here in Canada was, why would I ever bother buying a 5-year-old single malt? What's the point? Right? When I can go and buy a 12-year-old or 15 or 18 or whatever. That's where you've fallen into the trap. The trap that was set to make you believe that the older a whiskey is, the better a whiskey is. Do you know what's a good whiskey? A good whiskey.
The one in your glass.
The one in your glass, exactly. Age is just that. It's just age. What we are looking for from our whiskeys is maturity. Now, when it comes to whiskey, maturity can work kind of like people, right? We can have a whiskey that is low age, high maturity, or we can have a whiskey that is high age, low maturity. We all have that one friend. If you don't, it's you. But what we're looking at is maturity. And when we take in the natural geography of Kentucky, it's where we lend ourselves to maturity. We've got a first time use barrel. Nothing in there beforehand. It's ready to leach off as much flavor as humanly possible. You mix that, you put that in an area with incredibly hot summers, incredibly cold winters, you're going to get a very aggressive rate of maturation. Flavor development very rapidly over a short period of time. Now you look somewhere like Ireland, Scotland. It's not industry standard to use first time use barrels. Generally speaking, there's always exceptions, but generally speaking, second, third, fourth time use, right? But also doing that in a climate that I can tell you from experience does not get incredibly hot during the summertime, but also doesn't get incredibly cold during the winter, which means the interaction between the wood and whiskey inside that barrel is not as aggressive. It's just going to naturally take longer for the flavors to develop or longer for that spirit to mature. At 5 to 6 years in Kentucky, our flavor development will be along the same path as the same flavor development you would get at about 10 to 12 years in, say, Ireland, for example. Now, age is still age. We can't turn 5 years into 12 years, but again, the age shouldn't matter. The maturity of the product is what should matter. Now, first of all, what do you all think of the Clermont Steep? Good? Good. Different, right? What I love about it is that it's the closest thing we can really get in the world of whiskey to an agricultural product. Showcasing a single grain from a single place at a single moment in time. And speaking of moment in time. There is one other style of whiskey that we haven't touched on yet that I'm really, really excited to be able to share with you tonight. When I first started this job about 7 years ago or so, my boss at the time had said to me, you should write down a list, just a few things that, you know, if you leave the job in 2 years or 5 years or 10 years or whatever, it's a list of things you would like to be able to say you accomplished, you know? I'll be completely honest with you, I didn't know what this job entailed when I first started. So I was like, I don't know, like, I'd have to do this, I'd have to do this, I'd have to do this. And she was like, that's not your job. But one of the things in it that I did write down was I would like to be involved in bringing a single barrel program to Canada. Okay, that's doable. Let's ask the US. Let's see what they think. Hi US, can we do a single barrel? I said, no, you can't. Okay, cool, thank you. I asked twice a year, every year for nearly 6 years if we could do a single barrel. And luckily, we had done a couple of small releases here and there within Canada. I think we had maybe 6, potentially 7 barrels across the country since 2005. So now we're talking about 2018. Last year, last year, 2 years ago now, our global team down in New York said, you know what, let's maybe revisit this whole idea of single barrel, because we've been looking at Canada in the wrong way. We've been looking at it as kind of an extension of the US market, when in reality it's not. It's its own country, and it's an incredible market for bourbon. So let's start to look at it and treat it that way. So they gave me 5 barrels. So let's see if they'll sell. If they will, we'll start looking at maybe you can do 1 or 2 more here and there. This year, which is year number 3, we're up to 36 different barrels of Knob Creek being distributed across the world. Now, one of the best parts about a single barrel is that it's not just a whiskey. I mean, it is a whiskey, but it's a barrel that we cannot replicate. We can't synthesize another barrel to taste the exact same as what you're about to taste. This was one barrel of whiskey that was filled 10 years ago, went out and sat in the warehouse getting old and dusty. Our whiskey making team came along, tasted it, said, that tastes damn good. Hopefully someone will come and buy this. And now it's sitting in your glass. It's quite literally a moment in whiskey history. Something that can never be replaced. When we sell these barrels, or empty these barrels, we're looking at a maximum of 150 bottles. 150 opportunities to taste this flavor. That's it. It's gone forever. That is the beauty behind single barrels. And we have been really, really lucky to have worked closely with the Manitoba Liquor Mart here. The barrel you're about to drink is barrel number 2. So Knob Creek Single Barrel Select, Manitoba Liquor Mart, barrel number 2, 60% alcohol. So it's going to have a little bit of a, right? We don't like to call it a burn. We call it the Kentucky hug, right? Now sometimes the hug is like that friend you haven't seen for a while, right? So it's a nice little quick embrace and a pat on the back. Sometimes it's a creepy uncle. With Knob Creek, it's when grandma sees you for the first time in a year and will not let go. The finish is long, it's rich, it's bold. When I spoke about Booker wanting to return bourbon to his pre-prohibition glory, this is what Booker had in mind. Heavy flavor, weighty on the mouth. On the nose, it's dusty. Anyone's ever walked into a whiskey aging warehouse before? What you're smelling off your glass is what the air smells like in those buildings. A truly, truly beautiful whiskey. And I am happy to be able to let you guys know that it doesn't stop with this product. We will continue to release Knob Creek Single Barrel Selects, not just only here in Manitoba, but across the country. And this year we have changed our program up just ever so slightly. This will be the last one that you get to taste at 60% alcohol. from now on, 60. From now on, we're going to be barreling all, or bottling all mouthpiece single barrel selects at cask strength. So each bottle is going to be slightly different in ABV, as well as being pretty drastically different in flavor. And that ABV will range anywhere from 61 to 65% alcohol. This is not Creek. This is the world of pre-prohibition bourbon. It is
same.
the quintessential bourbon.
I just like the higher ABV.
So folks, that brings us through our 6 or 5, I guess, whiskeys that we're going to taste through this evening from the Beam Distilling Company.
For 60, it's not.
Hopefully,
not at all.
From seeing the variety that we did,
Just flavorful.
Go through flavor. One thing I'd be able to stand out
It's nice.
is that
Really nice.
bourbon, or even American whiskey as a whole, is not the one-trick pony.
I think I've got a bottle of this at home. I think I have a
also,
bottle of
as
this
a
at home.
distillery, our main goal is to make sure that we can continue to push that envelope, to try and release as many new flavors as possible, to innovate, to be creative. Because at the end of the day, it keeps us engaged, it keeps us active, but it also means that we continuously put different, creative, innovative spirits in your glass every single day, which is our number one goal when it comes to it, is making sure you have damn good whiskey. I just want to say, first of all, thank you to the team here at Hinds for all the work they've done here this evening. And there are some really cool rooms in Canada that you get to stand and talk about whiskey. This is like up here. It also smells freaking delicious in here. I will not smoke. It's going to be chewing like five packs of zings tonight. Thank you all for coming out. You know, one thing that I'm always really conscious of is, as people, the most valuable asset that you have is time. So the fact that you're prepared to give some of yours up to come and listen to our to me talk about our whiskeys and drink our whiskeys, that does not go unnoticed. Thank you all so very, very much for coming out. I hope you have a wonderful whiskey festival. Please drink responsibly. Please be safe. Do not drink and drive. And have a fucking amazing time. Thank you all. This is the most Irish thing I've ever done. Bye. We got a lot of really cool events happening here in Winnipeg within our company, and it pretty much rests solely on one person. Sitting over here, our lovely Jen Lee. It is Jen's birthday. Should we do it?
Yes!
Yeah? Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday.